Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
All right, good morning, everybody. It's 11 o'clock, so we'll get started. My name is Thomas Bowles. I'm the Ag Agent here in Prince William County. Today's topic is a backyard greenhouse right for you? So before we get into that, just want to mention that today is National Soil Health Day. Soil health is important for our future. The healthier our soils are, the more resilient they are, and the more resilient plants are that are grown in them. So just remember the soils. If you visit forthesoil.org today, there will be some more information on how you can be promoting healthier soils in your own yard and in your community. So everybody likes to talk about having a greenhouse, and obviously this isn't a backyard greenhouse. This is a greenhouse over at Brentsville High School. And everybody thinks about a greenhouse. They think about lots of plants. They think about it being nice, neat, orderly, and just a great asset to their garden. But it's not always the case. And so let's delve into some of the things to think about when considering a greenhouse, seeing if it's right for you, and seeing if there are other things that might work better for you. So the first thing you want to consider is, will your HOA allow it? I know of several people who have built greenhouses in their backyards only to have their HOA say that that's not a shed, so you can't have it. The other thing is, think about what you actually want to do with it. A lot of people like the idea of a greenhouse, but really aren't really sure how to use it and what they want to do with it. Can you get water and power to it? Will it be large enough to accommodate your need? And will it be truly cost effective? Those are things you want to think about. Another thing to consider is how you're going to site the greenhouse. You want to think about how much sun you're going to get in the summertime and in the winter. When you orient a greenhouse north to south, you tend to get less shade. When you do it east-west, you get one area that gets all the shade. And sometimes that can be an issue in the wintertime. You might have areas that have too much shade and basically are dead space and can't be used in the wintertime. It's just something to think about as you're planning your greenhouse. Another thing to consider is what kind of floor are you going to have? A lot of greenhouses have gravel floors to make sure they've got good drainage. Some greenhouses are just dirt floors. Some greenhouses have concrete floors, which make drainage and cleaning easier. And then you have to think about, well, okay, I've figured out what kind of floor I've had, and now I have to figure out what I'm going to put my plants on. Or am I going to use a bench? Am I going to put them in containers? Or am I actually going to have the plants in ground? And you need to think about your plant height. You need to think about annuals versus perennials. And you need to think about what physical limitations you might have now and into the future. So in the pictures, we have a couple of examples of different things. We've got containers on a bench. These tomatoes actually are in containers on the floor. Here we actually have these rows here have been cut into the floor, and these are plants growing in the ground. You might think about shape. Shape is important when it comes to both having access to light and ease of building. Most backyard greenhouses are either in this style over here in the lower left, where they're attached to the house, and that can be good and bad, or they're this sort of Quonset hut type shape, which is pretty easy to put up. But they're all different types of shapes. Think about the size that you want. Most home greenhouses are built too small. So it's really important to plan, and double plan your greenhouse before you actually decide on final measurements. You want to make it as wide as possible. The wider it is, the easier it is to add space just by going a little bit farther on the length. It's easy to add length, it's hard to add width. Consider where you're going to have plants, how you're going to be able to reach all of them. Consider your walkways. Is it going to be large enough for you to bring a wheelbarrow in to add more soil or to bring in plants? Is there other equipment, rolling carts or whatever that you're going to need in the greenhouse? Are you going to have enough space for it? The general rule of thumb is 1 square foot per 6-inch pot, plus any walkway space you need. And so that's important to think about. I've seen a lot of greenhouses built that are just way too small to be really usable. So consider that. Also consider in sizing, how am I going to use this? What am I going to use it for? Because that may affect how big or how small your greenhouse ends up. Another consideration is glazing. Traditionally, greenhouses have been glass. Glass is heavy, it's expensive. On the other hand, it's little maintenance. It can be weatherproof. That is to say that you won't have a lot of leakage of both rain or air. It is subject to breaking. A hailstorm can destroy a greenhouse. I've seen that happen. It's an expensive fix. It does require better structure than a fiberglass or plastic glazing. And it has really good light transmission. Basically, you're looking for at least 75% light transmission. And depending on whether it's double plane or single plane will allow more or less light to go through. Fiberglass is another glazing material. It's moderately heavy. Its price depends on how fine a grade fiberglass you use, and grade is important because especially the cheaper grades tend to discolor over time. Fiberglass is strong. It's easy to install. There are a lot of greenhouses that are fiberglass. It's usually corrugated fiberglass. Makes it pretty durable. It's pretty resistant to breakage. But discoloration, as I said, is a problem sometimes. A lot of people are going with polyfilm, which is light, relatively inexpensive. It's easy to install. The only problem is polyfilm only lasts a few years. UV light will break it down, and then you'll have to replace it. Its light transmission is not as good as fiberglass or glass. However, it's useful for most of the things you're going to do in the greenhouse. I've had a lot of polyfilm greenhouses and haven't had any sort of trouble with getting things to grow because of light. The other thing you need to think about is, what am I going to build this greenhouse out of? What's the skeleton going to be made of? Right now, building costs are incredibly high, and so everything is expensive. But on a relative scale, aluminum is very expensive. And aluminum structures you really need for glass glazed greenhouses. That way you can seal them and make them more weather tight. Galvanized steel is another option. You don't see that too much anymore except in pipe construction. Pressurized treated wood, that's probably the least expensive option. Some people don't want to use pressure treated wood, and so rot resistant wood like cedar and redwood can be used, but it can be really expensive and it can be very difficult to find. I can't imagine trying to build something out of cedar right now. The cost is just out of this world. So once you've sized it, you figured out what shape it's going to be, how big it's going to be, what you're going to build it out of, you need to think about airflow. And airflow is important for regulating humidity, heat, cooling, pest control. And what I mean by pest control is if you have to apply a pesticide, with airflow, you'll have a little more uniform distribution of that pesticide. And then plant strength, because plants without a little bit of airflow tend to grow up with weak stems. If they've got airflow pushing on them, they'll resist that and they'll build up their strength. They'll thicken up a little bit and they'll be stronger plants. Generally, you want some kind of cross ventilation, and that can be just natural cross ventilation, or that can be with fan and vent systems. There are many free online fan size calculators that you can use to figure out what size fan you need to get your airflow right for the size of greenhouse you have. The top picture here, we've got a greenhouse with a couple of fans to keep the air moving. The bottom picture I threw in here because this is an example of how an airflow can really affect what's going on in your greenhouse. Now, obviously, this is in the greenhouse. This is a drying house for turning grapes into raisins in southern Afghanistan. And there's obviously no heat or no power. This picture was taken on a 20 or 25 degree day, late in the summer, so it's been 110 to 130 pretty much for 3 months now. This building, like I said, is solid except for these what look like arrow slits really, but they're vent holes and they're oriented to the wind, and the temperature difference between outside and inside that was easily 50 degrees. I mean, it was like walking into a refrigerated cooler walking into that building. When you have really good airflow, you can do a lot of things, and in this case, this is set up for cooling, and that airflow allows that to be used for storage and for drying of perishable items. So while we're talking about temperature, we need to think about what we're going to do in our neck of the woods. For most of us, we need heat in the wintertime and we need some cooling in the summertime. And so what we need to think about are what are the different systems that we can use, how expensive are those systems, and how easy are they to use in order for us to have an effective greenhouse. So with heat, we've got forced air systems, we've got heat mats, we've got radiant floor systems, passive heat banks. Humidity and cold weather can help hold the heat. For cooling, we can use shading, we can use vents and fans, and we can use evaporative pads. And so here are some examples of some passive systems. So up here in the upper left, you have a banked greenhouse. These items over here, these are blankets that are being put down to hold the heat in. This is late in the day in wintertime, and they're putting these blankets down to hold heat in for the night. Over here, I've seen many greenhouses use this. They basically use black barrels filled with water. Sunlight comes in, hits those barrels, heats them up, and then at night, the heat is slowly released back into the air and it keeps the greenhouse warm-ish. Up here, this is an example of what's referred to as a Chinese greenhouse because it was developed in China. And so in the daytime, you've got sun coming in, it's warming everything up, it's warming this thick back wall. And sometimes these also have brick floors, again, to absorb more heat. A blanket's put down over the glass at nighttime. Heat comes up from the floor, heat comes over from the back wall. And this is kind of the theory behind using the banked system of barrels. On the cooling side, it's really difficult if you don't have power to cool things. Some of the ways that you can do that is through evaporative loss. And so in the center example, you've got vegetables in a vessel, typically clay lined. an inner pot and an outer pot with packed sand in between. And then you pour water into the sand, you put a wet cloth over top of it, and the evaporative power of heat transfer pulls the heat away from your vegetables. This is another example of that same type of concept. You've got a reed mat here that gets wetted down and evaporates out. This is a cold storage unit where this is probably 6 to 8 feet in depth. And it uses the fact that once you get below a certain level in the earth, it's cooler than the outside temperature. It's about 50 degrees. So they're using the cooling power of the earth as well as using this evaporative method. When we talk about active systems, we've got forced air jets and individual heating units that can heat the greenhouse. We've got fans and fan banks that will not only help with airflow, but will also cool a greenhouse. This is an evaporative pad. It's put on a stand. Water is dripped down on it. Air is forced through it. And as that air goes through it and the water evaporates, it cools the air, and the air that comes out is much, much cooler. Another thing to consider is how are you going to water? You can get really fancy or you can get really simple. You know, are you going to water with a hose, in which case you need to think about, do I have enough room to be able to reach things? You could use drip irrigation. You could get fancy and do overhead sprayers, where you get really fancy, and this is actually used in the lower right here. This is a commercial bed system where these tracks here are what's putting the water out. So you put all your flats on this and it floods from the bottom, and it does a really nice job of watering for you. It's kind of an ebb and flow system like you would have in hydroponics. Speaking of which, greenhouses are an excellent home for hydroponics, aquaculture, and aquaponics systems. Hydroponics are just growing plants in water. Aquaculture is raising fish, and aquaponics is raising fish and plants in a combined system. Generally, aquaponics is a little bit much for most homeowners, but hydroponics, it's a really good way to extend your season with hydroponics. And if you want to have fish and hold them over the winter, that's also a good way to do that, is use a greenhouse. Another consideration is utilities. Do you have enough power? Do you have enough water? If you don't, how much is it going to cost to install it? And then how much is it going to cost to operate it? So those are some economic things you need to really consider strongly. Also, if you're going to install any type of electrical system, make sure you do it with a licensed contractor. Electrical systems, especially in a humid situation like we tend to have in the summertime in greenhouses, need to have somebody who knows what they're doing set up a system that's going to work for you and not going to short circuit out on you. You need to consider pest control. The problem with greenhouses is that once a pest gets into the greenhouse, it makes it much more difficult to control. Some chemicals we can't use in greenhouses, and then other chemicals we can only use with additional personal protective equipment. Generally speaking, the best way to deal with pest management in a greenhouse is to use integrated pest management. And this is an approach that you start with scouting, you identify what the problem is, and then you start with the least toxic remedy and go from there. Most of the time in greenhouses, we recommend relying on natural controls instead of chemical controls just because it's easier. But in some cases, once you get a pest, it's really hard to get rid of it. So again, you want to consider, is my HOA going to allow this? What I'm going to do with it? Can I get water and power to it? Is it going to be large enough? Is it going to be worth the time and money to build this thing? For a lot of people, it may not be worth it, but there are other less expensive options that you might want to consider. One of them is a high tunnel, and this is an example of a high tunnel. This is actually in Petersburg at Virginia State University, and these are papaya plants that are growing in ground in this high tunnel. And a high tunnel or hoop house is basically a greenhouse without any sort of power. It's typically, but not always, it's typically bowed material, whether it's pipe or PVC. It's got, in most cases, has polyfilm on it, although I've seen some that are fiberglass. It has the same kind of pollinator and pest issues that greenhouses do in terms of it can be hard to get rid of pests. With both greenhouses and hoop houses, sometimes you have to introduce pollinators in order to get things to pollinate if you're holding plants on long enough to fruit. For example, in commercial production, a lot of times guys making tomatoes, they will get bumblebee hives and put them in their greenhouse to be able to pollinate the tomatoes. Something to consider. Most homeowners are not going to carry things to fruiting in their greenhouse, so that's not usually, pollinators usually aren't a problem with that. This is much less expensive than a greenhouse because you don't have the mechanical bits to it. It can be more maintenance in the sense that where greenhouses can have automatic venting systems, in hoop houses, generally speaking, you're going to have to manually do it. So for example, in this hoop house, somebody's got to open the door in the daytime and roll up part of the polyfilm to allow for cross ventilation and cooling. And then at night, roll these back down, close the door, those sorts of things. Again, there is no active heat source in a hoop house, so it isn't as year-round usable as a greenhouse would be. You can also try low tunnels, and low tunnels are basically high tunnels that you can't walk under. And they can be anywhere from a couple feet high to chest height. Generally, they're covered with polyfilm or spun fabric. Spun fabric doesn't give as much heat, isn't as thermally protective as poly is. It doesn't give as much solar retention, so that's something to consider. The advantage of both is that they can also exclude pests, depending on what pest you're trying to protect from. And they're relatively inexpensive, and it's pretty easy for one person to set up a low tunnel. Another option are cold frames. Cold frames are an excellent use for old glass windows or doors, and it's basically a box with glass on top. And it basically acts as a mini cold frame. Again, you have the issue of you're going to, on hot days, you're going to have to vent this. So that's got to be done manually. Most of the time I've seen them, they're made out of wood, but you can also, like here, you've got one that's made out of concrete. You can also put insulation board in to make it a little more thermally protected in the wintertime. Hotbeds are another option. Hotbeds are surprisingly old technology. In the 16 and 1700s, basically it's a cold frame with a heat source. So the heat source they would use is they would put several inches of fresh manure, soil, and then they plant into the soil. And so as that manure decayed, it would give off nutrients and it would also give off heat. And that would keep the soil warm, that would keep this area warm, and you can grow plants. In the 1800s, particularly in the latter half, people started using pipes underneath their soil to push steam or hot water through, and that would heat the soil and allow you to grow whatever. And then finally, today, what we tend to do is we tend to use heating cables, kind of like the radiant floor heating that you may have in your house. These heating cables are powerful enough to warm the soil, to keep the soil warm and keep the plants healthy. The one issue is that you've got to have power for that. The simplest way to go are cloches, and they're very labor intensive. Now, the traditional cloche is a bell-shaped glass covering that you put over plants. Now, as you might imagine, if you're putting one bell over one plant and you've got a lot of plants, that's pretty labor intensive. And glass bells are terribly expensive these days, but they do make plastic ones commercially, and you can use recycled soda and water bottles. The one thing I would suggest is make sure you have a hole at the top, because these over here in the upper right that don't have holes in the top, they're going to trap a lot of moisture and you're going to have really high humidity in there, and if you're not careful, you can run into disease problems. There are lots of resources for backyard greenhouses. I've listed several here. The biggest thing with greenhouses are consider your own situation. Whether you're doing cold frames or hotbeds or high tunnels or low tunnels or greenhouses, think it through before you decide on what you're going to do, because it can be an expensive mistake if you end up doing it wrong. With that, I will take questions.
I found that interesting about using the black containers there to warm up for warmth.
Yeah, it's an expensive way to do it, in the sense that buying all those barrels, but once you have the barrels and got them painted black, it's pretty much worry-free. I mean, there's not a lot of issue with plastic breaking down. There's not a lot of issue with leakage. So it's a pretty nice way to go. It's less expensive than building a greenhouse with a really thick wall to hold heat in.
Mm-hmm. Someone asks if they wonder if it would be a negative in selling a house like pools can be.
I think it might be, and the reason for that is that if I'm going to buy a house, I want to make sure that I know how everything works, and especially if you've got a greenhouse that is more mechanically oriented, where you've got the automatic opening of the vents and maybe automatic watering systems, that could be a negative in the sense that people might be intimidated about, well, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to use it?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important, if you have one of those systems, to save the manuals. We see this in schools a lot, where they put a greenhouse in and one teacher's responsible for it, and when that teacher leaves, no one can find the manuals, so no one knows how to operate the greenhouse.
Yeah.
And the greenhouse becomes a very expensive storage closet.
That's right, it does. And in our area, even just cold frames, because we can extend our cool season crops pretty much into November and even later, because I've grown kale all winter with a cold frame over it.
Cold frames work really well, and low tunnels work really well. Also, at our teaching garden in Bristow, we've had good success overwintering crops with just a cold frame. A lot of times we'll run into a situation where Brussels sprouts in particular, we can't harvest them in a timely manner before first frost, and so we let them go, and that frost helps reduce the bitterness in them, and then we would harvest them in the spring.
And then somebody asks about the fancy British Victorian greenhouse. I'm not familiar with that.
British Victorian greenhouses are glass houses, basically. A lot of times, let me go back for a second. A lot of times they would be heated with steam or hot water under the floor, but not always. If there's a specific question about them, I'm happy to answer it, but I'm not sure what else to say about them.
It's from Laurel, and she mentioned Hartley.
I'm sorry, she mentioned what?
Hartley, that might be a design or any more information, Laurel?
Oh, yeah, this is Laurel. I just have fun ordering these catalogs from England where they have these gorgeous Victorian style greenhouses that are custom made and, probably cost this house to install.
Yeah.
But they're the lower half is brick, and then they have, glass panes, and there's different accessories you can add to it. I was just wondering just curious if you ever knew somebody in the States who had one installed and how reliable and what the lifespan is of those. Thank you.
So backing up to the first question, in the U.S., the only ones I've seen are places like Biltmore, some of the arborariums, some of the more formal gardens will have Victorian style greenhouses. The issue with them is that they've got the money to build them. They seem to be fairly reliable because some of those have been around for decades. Some of them have been around for at least a century. But from a homeowner point of view, I'm not sure that that's really going to be worth the investment. Although you could do the brickwork yourself and put basically you could put brickwork all around the base, and then put something like this on top of it, or something that's actually glass on top of it, a glass greenhouse on top of it.
So there's
I'm sorry. I had two
Go ahead,
quick
Laurel.
Yeah, I just had two quick comments. First of all, I believe I picked up on winter sowing from you guys,
Mhm.
and started it late for the first time. I think I started in February, March, and I was just tickled pink about that whole mini greenhouse in milk jug concept, where you don't have to water it, leave it and forget it, and versus trying to do something in the basement with grow lights, which I never tried before. But so one, I just wanted to thank you for that, because I'm really excited about doing that full season next winter. And then secondly, you had a wonderful hydroponics class that also excited me, and I want to try growing lettuce from food grade quality 5-gallon jugs. So I'm really excited about that. Thank you for that. And then the third and last comment I had is I just happened to visit a local nursery and was chatting with the owner, and he happened to be watering his flowers. He has maybe 15 greenhouses, and he sells mostly annuals primarily, or grows his own annuals. And he, as we're chatting, he's just wasting this incredible amount of water out of a hose as he waters individual plants. And I asked, boy, what's your water bill like? And he said, well, it's nothing like compared to my gas. He had a 4-inch, I guess, gas line going into his place. But he said that he found all the automatic watering systems he's tried in the past would either clog or leak, and he's not aware of the leak. Plus, it also didn't give him an opportunity to monitor his plants daily to see if they're going south or have bug issues or whatnot. And so I really found that fascinating, because it was it was top-down watering, from a hose, and a lot of it, and very inefficient. But the other thing he made a comment on is he likes the clean look on the top of the greenhouses where you don't have drip hoses and everything. So his greenhouses, they're quite large, obviously, but they're free of cables and hoses. And he had cross ventilation. He rolls it up And he said he leaves them up a lot longer than you would think. And that air circulation, of course, was a real success for him. So that's it. I was just fascinated by that industry and how they managed to find the best ways for them. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That's why the water issue is why some greenhouse growers have gone to this type of system where it's watering from below. It makes it more efficient. It does require you to actually walk the plants though, and to get a good idea on a regular basis of how they're doing health-wise.
So Mary asks, are professional building maintenance services available? Mary, do you want to clarify what you're to install or maintain the greenhouse? She's still here. Hi, Mary. Installation and repair, she says.
Okay. There are companies that will do the installation. It can be pricey, which is why most people do it themselves. But if you look at most of the companies that sell greenhouses, most of them, if they're relatively local, can help with installation. The problem is finding one. In most cases, it's easier and less expensive to do it yourself. In terms of greenhouse repair, it really depends on what you're trying to have repaired. Polyfill, for example, a lot of times you can do that yourself with duct tape. Or they sell patches for holes in poly where you can just patch it over with a clear, basically it's like a big Band-Aid, big clear Band-Aid that you can put over small holes. But a lot of it is do it yourself.
Thank you, she says. Any other questions, anybody? So next week is problems with your landscape, correct? June
Yes.
30th? Yes, and that should be a good class.
Well, thank you all for coming, and we will see you next time. Have a good week.
If you're interested in lawn care, please contact our Best Lawns Coordinator, Natalie Walker, at nwalker@pwcgov.org. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know with your questions, comments, and suggestions for other classes and videos. We can be reached at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.